More tricks. The sun had to be up somewhere, but you'd never have known it. The angry clouds had thickened, and the light was still poor. Positively beggarly, in fact. As far as Corporal Tunney could tell, and somewhat to his surprise, no one had moved. The helmets and spears still showed above the stretch of wall that he could see, shifting a little from time to time, but going nowhere fast. Mitterick's attack was well underway. That much they could hear. But on this forgotten far end of the battle, the Northmen waited. "Are they still there?" asked Worth. Waiting for action like this got most men shitting themselves. Worth was unique in that it seemed it was the one thing that could stop him. "They're still there." "Not moving?" squeaked Yoke. "If they were moving, we'd be moving, wouldn't we?" Tunney peered through his eyeglass once again. "No, they're not moving." "Is that fighting I can hear?" muttered Worth, as a gust of wind brought the echoing of angry men, horses, and metal across the stream. "It's that, or it's a serious disagreement in a stable. Do you think it's a disagreement in a stable?" "No, Corporal Tunney." "No, neither do I." "Then what's going on?" asked Yoke. A riderless horse appeared from over the rise, stirrups flapping at its flanks, trotted down towards the water, stopped, and started nibbling at the grass. Tunney lowered his eyeglass. "Honestly, I'm not sure." All around them, rain tapped at the leaves. The trampled barley was scattered with dead and dying horses, dead and dying men. In front of Calder and his stolen standards, they were heaped up in a bloody tangle. Only a few strides away, 3 carls were arguing with each other as they tried to free their spears, all impaled in the same Union rider. A few boys had been sent scurrying out to gather spent arrows. A couple more had been unable to resist clambering into the 3rd pit to get an early start at picking over the bodies there, and White-Eye was roaring at them to get back into line. The Union cavalry were all done. A brave effort, but a stupid one. It seemed to Calder the two often went together. To make matters worse, having failed once, they'd insisted on giving it another try, still more doomed. 70 or so had jumped the 3rd pit on the right, managed to get over Clail's wall and kill a few archers before they were shot or speared themselves. All pointless as mopping a beach. That was the trouble with pride and courage and all those clenched-jawed virtues bards love to harp on. The more you have, the more likely you are to end up bottom in a pile of dead men. All the Union's bravest had achieved was to give Calder's men the biggest boost to their spirits they'd had since Bethod was king of the Northmen. They were letting the Union know it now, as the survivors rode or limped or crawled back towards their lines. They danced about and clapped and whooped into the drizzle. They shook each other's hands and thumped each other's backs and clashed their shields together. They chanted Bethod's name, and Scales, and even quite frequently Calder's, which was gratifying. The comradeship of warriors, who would have thought? He grinned around as men cheered and brandished their weapons at him, held up his sword and gave it a wave in return. He wondered whether it was too late to smear a bit of blood on the blade, since he hadn't quite got around to swinging it. There was plenty of blood about, and he doubted its previous owners would miss it now. "Chief." "Eh?" Pale as snow was pointing off to the south. "Might want to pull 'em back into position." The rain was getting weightier, fat drops leaving the earth spattered with dark spots, pinging from the armor of the living and the dead. It had drawn a misty haze across the battlefield to the south, but beyond the riderless horses aimlessly wandering, and the horseless riders stumbling back towards the old bridge, Calder thought he could see shapes moving in the barley. He shielded his eyes with one hand. More and more emerged from the rain, turning from ghosts to flesh and metal. Union foot. Vast blocks of them, trampling forward in carefully measured, well-ordered, dreadfully purposeful ranks, polearms held high, flags struck limp by the wet. Calder's men had seen them too, and their triumphant jeering was already a memory. The barking voices of named men rang through the rain, bringing them grimly back to their places behind the third pit. White-Eye was marshalling some of the lightly wounded to fight as a reserve and plug any holes. Calder wondered if they'd be plugging holes in him before the day was out. It looked a good bet. "Don't suppose you've got any more tricks?" asked Pale as Snow. "Not really, unless you counted running like hell." "You?" "Just the one," and the old warrior carefully wiped the blood from his sword with a rag and held it up. "Oh." Calder looked down at his own clean blade, glistening with beads of water. "That." The tyranny of distance. "I can't see a damn thing," hissed Finray's father, taking a stride forwards and peering through his eyeglass again, presumably to no more effect than before. "Can you?" "No, sir," grumbled one of his staff unhelpfully. They had witnessed Mitterick's premature charge in stunned silence. Then, as the first light crawled across the valley, the start of Jallenhorm's advance. Then the drizzle had begun. First Osrung had disappeared in the grey pall on the right, then Clail's Wall on the left, then the old bridge and the nameless inn where Finray had almost died yesterday. Now even the shallows were half-remembered ghosts. Everyone stood silent, paralysed with anxiety, straining for sounds that would occasionally tickle at the edge of hearing over the damp whisper of the rain. For all that they could see now, there might as well have been no battle at all. Finray's father paced back and forth, the fingers of one hand fussing at nothing. He came to stand beside her, staring off into the featureless grey. "I sometimes think there isn't a person in the world more powerless than a supreme commander on a battlefield," he muttered. "How about his daughter?" He gave her a tight smile. "Are you all right?" She thought about smiling back, but gave up on it. "I'm fine," she lied, and quite transparently too. Apart from the very real pain through her neck whenever she turned her head, down her arm whenever she used her hand, and across her scalp all the time, she still felt a constant, suffocating worry. Time and again she would startle, staring about like a miser for his lost purse, but with no idea what she was even looking for. "You have far more important things to worry about." As if to prove her point, he was already striding away to meet a messenger, riding up towards the barn from the east. "News? Colonel Brock reports that his men have begun their attack on the bridge in Osrung." Hal was in the fight then, leading from the front, no doubt. She felt herself sweating more than ever under her clothes, the damp beneath Hal's coat, meeting the damp leaking through from above in a crescendo of chafing discomfort. "Colonel Brint, meanwhile, is leading an assault against the savages, who yesterday—" His eyes flickered nervously to Finray and back. "Against the savages." "And?" asked her father. "That is all, Lord Marshal." He grimaced. "My thanks. Please bring further news when you're able." The messenger saluted, turned his horse, and galloped off through the rain. "No doubt your husband is distinguishing himself enormously in the assault." Baez leaned beside her on his staff, bald pate glistening with moisture. "Leading from the front in the style of Herod the Great, a latter-day hero. I've always had the greatest admiration for men of that stamp." "Perhaps you should try it yourself." "Oh, I have. I was quite the firebrand in my youth, but an unquenchable thirst for danger is unseemly in the old. Heroes have their uses, but someone has to point them the right way, and clean up afterwards. They always raise a cheer from the public, but they leave a hell of a mess." Baez thoughtfully patted his stomach. "No, a cup of tea at the rear is more my style. Men like your husband can gather the plaudits." "You're far too generous." "Few indeed would agree." But where is your tea now? Bias frowned at his empty hand. My servant has more important errands to run this morning. Can there be anything more important than attending to your whims? Oh, my whims stretch beyond the kettle. Hoofbeats echoed out of the rain, a lone rider thumping up the track from the west, everyone straining breathlessly to see as a chinless frown emerged from the wet gloom. "Felnick!" snapped Finray's father. "What's happening on the left?" "Mitterick bloody well went off half-drawn!" frothed Felnick as he swung from the saddle. "Sent his cavalry across the barley in the dark! Pure bloody recklessness!" Knowing the state of the relationship between the two men, Finray suspected Felnig had made his own contribution to the fiasco. "We saw," her father forced through tight lips, evidently coming to a similar conclusion. "The man should be bloody drummed out!" "Perhaps later. What was the outcome?" "It was still in doubt when I left." "So you haven't the slightest idea what's going on over there?" Felnick opened his mouth, then closed it. "I thought it best to return at once and report Mitterick's mistake, rather than inform me of its consequences. My thanks, Colonel, but I am already amply supplied with ignorance." And her father turned his back before Felnig had the chance to speak, striding across the hillside again to look fruitlessly to the north. "Shouldn't have sent them," she heard him mutter as he squelched past. "Should never have sent them." Bias sighed, the sound niggling at her sweaty shoulders like a corkscrew. "I sympathize most deeply with your father." Finray was finding that her admiration for the first of the Magi was steadily fading, while her dislike only sharpened with time. "Do you?" she said, in the same way one would say "shut up," and with the same meaning. If Bias took it, he ignored it. "Such a shame we cannot see the little people struggle from afar. There is nothing quite like looking down upon a battle, and this is a large one, even in my experience. But the weather answers to no one." Bias grinned up into the increasingly solemn heavens. "A veritable storm! What drama, eh? What better accompaniment to a clash of arms? Did you call it up yourself, just for the atmosphere?" "I wish I had the power. Only imagine there could be thunder whenever I approached. In the old time, my master, great Juvens, could call down lightning with a sword, make a river flood with a gesture, summon a hoar-frost with a thought. Such was the power of his art." And he spread his hands wide, tipping his face into the rain and raising his staff towards the streaming heavens. "But that was long ago." He let his arms drop. "These days the winds blow their own way, like battles. We who remain must work in a more roundabout fashion." More hoofbeats, and a dishevelled young officer cantered from the murk ahead. "Report!" demanded Felnick at great volume, making Finray wonder how he had lasted so long without being punched in the face. "Jallenhorm's men have flushed the enemy from the orchards," answered the messenger breathlessly, "and are climbing the slope at the double." "How far have they gone?" asked Finray's father. "When I last saw them, they were well on the way up to the smaller stones, the children, but whether or not they were able to take them—" "Heavy resistance?" "Becoming heavier." "When did you leave them?" "I rode here with all dispatch, sir, so perhaps a quarter of an hour ago." Finray's father bared his teeth at the downpour. The outline of the hill the heroes stood on was little more than a darker smudge in a curtain of grey. She could follow his thoughts. By now they might have captured the summit in glory, be engaged in furious combat, or have been bloodily driven off. Anyone or no one, alive or dead, victorious or defeated. He spun on his heel. "Saddle my horse!" Bias's smugness was snuffed out like a candle flame. "I would advise against it. There is nothing you can do down there, Marshal Croy." "There is certainly nothing I can do up here, Lord Bias," said her father curtly, stepping past him and towards the horses. His staff followed, along with several guards, Felnick snapping out orders in every direction, the headquarters suddenly alive with rattling activity. "Lord Marshal," shouted Byers, "I deem this unwise." Her father did not even turn. "By all means remain here, then," and he planted one boot in the stirrup and pulled himself up. "By the dead," hissed Byers under his breath. Finri gave him a sickly smile. "It seems you may be called to the front after all. Perhaps you can see the little people struggle at first hand." The first of the Magi did not appear amused. Blood. "They're coming!" That much Beck knew already, but men were packed so tight into the heroes he didn't know much else. Wet furs, wet armor, weapons gleaming with rain, scowling faces running with water. The stones themselves were streaky shadows, ghosts beyond a forest of jagged spears, spit and splattering whisper of drops on metal, crash and clang of steel echoing from the slopes, shouts of battle muffled by the downpour. A great surge went through the crowd, and Beck was lifted right off his feet, kicking at nothing, dumped in a mass of punching, jostling, shouting men. It took him a moment to realize they weren't the enemy, but there were a lot of blades poking every which way even so, and it didn't have to be a Union one to stick you in the fruits. Hadn't been a Union sword killed Reft, had it? Someone elbowed him in the head, and he staggered sideways, was knocked by someone else, and onto his knees. A trampling boot squashed his hand into the mud. Dragged himself up by a shield with a dragon's head painted on it, owner not best pleased. Man with a beard roaring at him. Battle sounds were louder, men struggling to get away or get towards. Men clutching at wounds, blood run pink in the rain, clutching at weapons, all dripping wet and mad on fear and anger. By the dead, he wanted to run. He wasn't sure if he was crying, just knew he couldn't fail again. Stand with his crew, that's what Craw said, wasn't it? Stand with his chief. He blinked into the storm, saw a flash of Black Dow's black standard flapping, soaked through. Knew Craw had to be near it. Pressed towards it between the jerking bodies, boots slithering in the churned-up slop. Thought he caught a glimpse of Droft's snarling face, heard a roar, and a spear came at him. Not even fast. He moved his head to the side, far as he could, straining with everything he had, and the point slid past his ear. Someone squealed in the other one, dropped against him, warm on his shoulder. Grunting and gurgling, hot and wet all down his arm. He gasped, wriggled his shoulders, shrugging the corpse off, working it down towards the mud. Another surge in the crowd, and Beck was dragged sliding to the left, mouth open as he fought to stay upright. Warm rain spattered his cheek, the man in front of him suddenly whisked away, and he was left blinking at space. A strip of mud covered with sprawled bodies and rain-pocked puddles and broken spears, and on the other side of it, the enemy. Dow roared something over his shoulder, but Craw couldn't hear him, could hardly hear anything over the hissing of the rain and the clamour of rough voices, loud as a storm themselves. Too late for orders. Time comes, a man just has to stick with the orders he's given, trust in his men to do the right thing and fight. He thought maybe he saw the hilt of the Father of Swords waving between the spears. Should have been with his dozen, stood with his crew. Why had he said yes to being Dow's second? Maybe 'cause he'd been Three Trees' second once, and he'd somehow thought if he had the place he used to have, the world would be like it used to be. An old fool grabbing at ghosts. Way too late. Should have married Colwyn when he had the chance. Asked her anyway, given her the chance to turn him down. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathed in the wet, cold air. "Should have stayed a carpenter," he whispered. But the sword had been the easier choice. To work wood you need all manner of tools, chisels and saws, axes great and small, nails and hammers,